Hello. Today is the Friday of the third week of Advent. 3 candles are lit in the wreath. We're reading Tabitha's Travels, and today's chapter is titled Kidnapped. Tabitha pulled at the bindings around her wrists, but with her arms tied tightly behind her back, she could not break loose. The cloth tied in her mouth like the bit on a horse kept her screams from being heard, but nothing could keep the stench of dead animals from her nose. She had been sitting at the table in the inn, thinking about her father, when a rough and smelly hand covered her face. Arms as thick as a camel's thigh lifted her off her stool and clamped tightly around her waist. Tabitha screamed, of course, but as her abductor slipped through the crowd of traders, travelers, and taxpayers, they all just turned and looked the other way. Before she could say dancing camels, she had been carried to the back room of a butcher shop. Blood covered the walls and floors from the hundreds of animals slaughtered here. It made everything black and sticky and horribly smelly. Tabitha struggled again, trying to loosen the bindings on her wrists and ankles. If only I could stretch them a bit, she thought. But the cloth was well broken in, and any stretch it once had was pulled from it long ago. The thought that she should be crying passed through Tabitha's head, but she quickly decided that if she were going to free herself and save her father, she didn't have time for such things. Crying is something Rachel would do, she thought. I must be stronger than that. And yet, no matter how hard she thought or how much she struggled, she could find no way out of the situation. The walls were strong, and she had heard the locking bolt on the other side of the door slide into place when her captor had left her here. The room was empty, at least as far as she could see, except for a heavy square table in the middle and half of a deer hanging from the ceiling. But it was dark, with only a few cracks of light coming through the boards of the door. Tabitha began to shiver, fearing what might happen to her and where she would be taken. "Jehovah help me," she whispered over and over. The bolt slammed open with a crack, and Tabitha jumped. Her heart began to race as the door swung inward. A man stood in the doorway, but he was lit from the back, so she couldn't see his face. He stood for a moment and then walked over to Tabitha. Now she could see that it was not the same man who had kidnapped her. This one was smaller and more round. The man leaned down and looked her over closely. "Yes, you will do nicely," the man said. He had an accent that Tabitha did not recognize, and he dressed in the strange clothes of some other world. "You'll fetch a good price," he continued, "and then you'll be off to Rome, where you'll have a pleasant life as a slave girl to a master." The man did not speak with a cruel voice. In fact, Tabitha thought he sounded no more concerned than if he were telling her he should go home and feed his dog. This was a business deal, Tabitha realized. He's a seller, and I'm his wares. This made her furious, and she began kicking at the man, but he only stood and stepped back. "You should save your strength," he said, looking down on her. "The voyage to Rome will not be as pleasant as this room." She thought that any place could be worse the thought that any place could be worse than this slaughterhouse made Tabitha gag. She must do everything possible to escape. She must save her father. The man turned and headed back to the door. In that instant, Tabitha wormed her way to her feet, ran across the room, and threw herself at the man's back. He spun around, surprised, and she butted him in the stomach with her head like a goat. At that moment, the outer door of the butcher shop opened, and Tabitha saw a woman enter. In that split second, the woman saw Tabitha, or so it seemed to the captive girl, but then the man pushed her down with his foot and slammed the door shut. As fast as she could, Tabitha scooted over to the door and found a crack wide enough that she could see through. "I have come for some deer meat," the muffled voice of the woman said. "I heard you have some fresh. I will require the hind quarter." "The shop is closed," a man's voice said gruffly, and Tabitha supposed it must be her original captor. "Come back tomorrow." "I am not here for myself," the woman said, and it seemed to Tabitha that she must be a very bold woman to talk that way to a man. "I am the new cook for King Herod, and he awaits me in the fortress." Tabitha didn't need to see the man's face to know he had turned pale. Forgive me, good lady, he stammered. I will personally deliver the meat to the fortress within the hour. Very well, the woman answered coldly. If I am pleased, you will have more business from me in the future. Tabitha couldn't believe that a woman could have such power over a man, and couldn't let this opportunity for rescue pass. As the woman was speaking, Tabitha began kicking at the door and screaming through the gag in her mouth. After a few moments, she stopped to hear what effect her cry for help may have had. The butcher was obviously frightened. Ignore the racket, he told the woman, trying to usher her out the door. It is just a goat who does not look forward to being butchered. Or perhaps a young girl you have kidnapped to sell into slavery, the woman answered tartly. Tabitha could see the butcher's face now as well. Surely this powerful woman will save me, she thought. Good lady, there is no girl. The woman silenced him with an upheld hand. There is a girl, she said. But fear not, your business is your own. I came only for meat, not intrigue. The butcher relaxed and promised the cook excellent meat at a fair price as he finally got her out of the door. Once it had closed behind her, the butcher seemed to collapse into a mound of jelly. We must move the girl soon, he said. Tabitha realized the other man must still be in the shop. Yes, the other voice said, but first you must deliver your goods as promised. She will surely tell the guards what she has seen if you are late. Agreed, was all the first man said. A moment later, the door to Tabitha's jail cell opened and the butcher walked in. He carried a large cleaver in his hand and stopped to look down on Tabitha. I should use this on you, he said, for making all that noise. He began hacking away at the deer carcass as he continued. But all is well, and you will fetch a good price if you are alive, but none at all if you are dead. A few minutes later, the butcher hefted the hind quarter of deer over his shoulder and left the room. The door slammed shut, and Tabitha heard the bolt slide into place once more. Several minutes passed as Tabitha heard the man working on the meat. After a while, the butcher left to deliver the venison to the palace. It was then that Tabitha realized she had stopped shivering. In fact, she wasn't afraid at all. It was as if Jehovah were sitting right there next to her, his arm around her, promising to care for her. A few minutes later, the butcher returned. What about the girl? He asked. There was a pause, and then the other man said, Go get her. Once again, Tabitha finds herself in a terrifying situation. Once again, she calls on God for help. Once again, he hears her and answers. Do you have that kind of faith? Being friends with Jesus isn't just a mental exercise. It's not just something we do in our heads. He is real. He is alive. And our friendship with him is real and alive. But it's not something we can stick in a drawer until we're in trouble. Like any other friendship, we have to keep working at it. We have to talk to Jesus every day, tell him how we feel about what's happening in our lives, tell him that we love him. Then when the tough times come, he's already right there next to us, waiting to help us like any good friend. In Psalms it says, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. When we celebrate Christmas, we are celebrating that the God who created the universe has chosen to come down and live among us and in us. Develop that friendship. Get to know Jesus. He's here to help you whenever you need it. All you have to do is ask.